The stage was already a quarter-mile down the road when Margaret Easton realized she was still standing in the red dust of Caldwell, Kansas. Her traveling bag clutched so hard against her chest that her knuckles had gone white as bleached bone. She had not moved. She had not called out. She had not run after it. And Timothy Boone, the man who was supposed to have put her on that stage himself, the man who had spent the last 4 days making it absolutely clear that she needed to go back east where she belonged, was standing 6 feet behind her with his hat in his hands and his jaw set so tight it looked like carved stone, and he had not moved either. Neither of them moved. The stage rounded the bend at the edge of town and disappeared behind the cottonwood stand along Slate Creek, the sound of hooves and rattling wheels swallowed by the hot August wind, and still neither one of them spoke. Margaret's chest was heaving. She could feel the furious heat of it, the humiliation and the hurt and the something else, that terrible, inconvenient something else that had been building in her chest for 4 days like a storm she had no business standing in. She turned around. Timothy was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on a man's face before, and she had looked at a great many men's faces during her 26 years in Boston. It was not relief. It was not guilt. It was something more stripped down and honest than either of those things, something that looked almost like a man who had just been caught holding a knife to his own throat and did not particularly regret it. "You didn't get on the stage," he said. His voice was low and rough like creek gravel. "You didn't put me on it," she said back. The silence between them was enormous. It was the size of the Kansas plains that stretched out in every direction around this sun-beaten town, vast and windswept, and full of things that could kill you if you were not paying attention. Timothy Boone pressed his hat against his thigh and looked away toward the creek bend where the stage had vanished, and Margaret watched his throat move as he swallowed something down. "Next stage comes in 3 days," he said finally. "I know," she said. He looked back at her then, and she held his gaze because she was Margaret Easton, and she had crossed 1,000 miles of wilderness on a promise that had turned out to be a lie, and she had survived it, and she was not about to look away first. "You should go inside out of the heat," he said. "You should tell me the truth," she said. Another silence. A dog barked somewhere down the main street. The wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek and made a sound like whispering. Timothy Boone put his hat back on his head, tugged the brim down against the glare, and said the last thing Margaret had expected to hear from a man who had spent 4 days trying to be rid of her. "Yes," he said quietly, "I probably should." He turned and walked back toward the livery, and after a moment Margaret Easton picked up her bag and followed him, because what else was there to do, with the stage gone and 3 days stretching out ahead of them, and that enormous, dangerous something else still sitting in her chest, refusing to be put on any coach heading east. It had begun, as most disasters in Margaret Easton's life had begun, with a letter. She had received it in April of 1882, in the narrow parlor of her aunt's house on Beacon Street in Boston, where she had been living since the failure of her father's textile business had left her without a home of her own at the age of 23. The letter had come from a land agent in Wichita, a man named Horace Pemberton, who had written on behalf of a client seeking a woman of good education and steady character to come west and serve as a schoolteacher for the children of Caldwell, Kansas. The position included board, a modest salary, and the prospect. This was the word Mr. Pemberton had used, prospect, as though it were a vein of silver waiting to be mined, of a permanent establishment in the community. Margaret had been in her aunt's parlor for 3 years by then, 3 years of being graciously tolerated. 3 years of her aunt's carefully worded remarks about what a pity it was that Margaret's father had not been more prudent. What a shame it was that Margaret herself was not a little more adaptable, meaning a little more willing to accept the attentions of whatever dull, appropriate man her aunt managed to parade through the parlor on a Sunday afternoon. 3 years of feeling like a book shelved in the wrong library, perfectly intact but entirely out of place. She had written back to Mr. Pemberton the same day. What she had not known, what Mr. Pemberton had failed to mention in his careful, prospecting letter, was that the position had already been filled by the time her acceptance arrived. The young woman originally hired had gotten married in June and declined to come west after all. Mr. Pemberton, rather than write back and explain this, had apparently decided to let Margaret discover it on arrival, reasoning, perhaps, that a woman who had already traveled 1,000 miles would be more amenable to the alternative arrangement he had in mind. The alternative arrangement turned out to be a proposal of marriage from a cattle rancher named Harold Fitch. Harold Fitch was 54 years old, built like a rain barrel, and possessed of the particular brand of confidence that comes from having a great deal of money in a place where a great deal of money is impressive. He had come to the stage depot in Caldwell on the afternoon of July 30th, 1882, to look at the woman Pemberton had sent him, and he had looked at Margaret the way a man looks at a horse he is considering purchasing appraisingly, with attention to the soundness of the teeth and the width of the hips. Margaret had looked right back at him with the expression her aunt had always called her difficult expression, and Harold Fitch had turned to Pemberton and said, "She'll do," as though she were not standing 4 feet away with a full command of the English language and the capacity to have opinions about the verb to do. She had refused him on the spot, loudly, and without any of the diplomatic softening her aunt had spent 3 years trying to install in her. Pemberton had been flustered. Fitch had been furious, and Timothy Boone, who happened to be standing at the far end of the depot collecting a shipment of fence wire, had looked up from his manifest and watched the whole scene with the kind of still attention that Margaret had noticed immediately and filed away as significant. It was Pemberton who had dragged Timothy into it, which seemed, in retrospect, to be the moment where everything went wrong and right simultaneously. Pemberton had grabbed Timothy by the arm the way small, panicking men grab large, calm ones desperately, as though hoping some of the calm might transfer, and said, "Boone, you got a spare room at your place, haven't you? Just for a few days, just until we can sort this situation out. Miss Easton needs somewhere respectable to stay." Timothy Boone had looked at Pemberton the way a man looks at a trap he can see plainly but cannot avoid without stepping over someone who needs help, and said, "Mrs. Crane runs the boarding house on 2nd Street. Mrs. Crane is full up with the cattle drovers," Pemberton said. "The hotel burned 2 weeks ago, still rebuilding." Timothy had looked at Margaret then. She had looked back at him. She had been dusty and exhausted and furious and more than a little frightened, though she would not have admitted the last one under any circumstances. He was tall, lean-built in the way of men who work outdoors, with dark eyes under the brim of a worn hat and the kind of steady, unhurried manner that suggested he did not do anything impulsively. "I have a spare room," he said, to her and not to Pemberton. "My housekeeper, Mrs. Aldridge, is on the property. It would be respectable." "I am not a charity case," Margaret said. "I did not say you were," he said. "I said I have a spare room." She had accepted, because there was nowhere else, and because something in the directness of his offer, no pity, no performance, just a plain statement of available accommodation, had made it feel safe in a way she could not have articulated then and still could not quite articulate now, standing in the dry August heat watching him walk away from her toward his livery. The first day had been formal and uncomfortable in the way that most necessary arrangements between strangers are. Timothy Boone's property sat a mile outside of town at the edge of what had been prime cattle country, before the expansion of the railroad had begun changing everything about how cattle moved through Kansas. He ran horses now, not cattle, good working horses, sold to ranchers and the army alike, and the place reflected a man who worked hard and was competent at it and had not given much thought to aesthetics. The house was plain and square, built of good lumber with a porch that faced east to catch the morning light. Mrs. Aldridge, the housekeeper, was a wide, strong woman in her 50s who looked at Margaret with frank assessment and said, "You eat supper at 6. I don't hold it for anyone." This was the entirety of her greeting, and Margaret found it one of the most honest welcomes she had received in years. The spare room was clean and had a window that looked out over the horse pastures. Margaret sat on the edge of the narrow bed that first evening and listened to the sound of the plains, enormous, alive, nothing like Boston, and felt something in her chest begin, very tentatively, to unclench. She told herself it was purely relief at having a roof and not to read anything more significant into it. She was wrong about that, but she did not know it yet. The second day was when she began to understand Timothy Boone. He was up before dawn. She knew this because the sound of him in the kitchen woke her, not the noise of a clumsy man stumbling around in the dark, but the quiet, purposeful sounds of someone who has performed the same morning rituals so many times they have become a kind of prayer. By the time she came down, dressed and composed and determined to be useful rather than ornamental, there was coffee on the stove, and he was already gone to the pasture. Mrs. Aldridge gave her a look that could have meant a number of things and directed her to sit down and eat. "How long has Mr. Boone been on this property?" Margaret asked. 7 years, Mrs. Aldridge said, setting a plate of biscuits and salt pork on the table. "Came out from Missouri in '75. Built the house himself first winter. He's never married." Mrs. Aldridge gave her the look again. "No," she said, in a tone that suggested this was not a subject open for casual inquiry. Margaret ate her breakfast and thought about a man who had come out from Missouri alone at whatever age he would have been in 1875. She would later learn he was 30 now, which meant he had been 23, younger than she was now, and built a house himself through a Kansas winter, and what that said about the kind of person he was. She was in the pasture by mid-morning, because sitting inside was not something she was constitutionally capable of for very long. Timothy was working one of the younger horses on a long lead line, moving the animal in circles with a patience that struck her as almost meditative. He saw her at the fence but did not stop what he was doing, which she appreciated. She watched for a while. The horse was a bay with a nervous eye, and Timothy kept his movements small and consistent, never doing anything that would startle, never demanding more than the animal could give, always rewarding the right response with a slight release of pressure. It was a language, she realized. A very particular, very patient language. "What's his name?" she called out. "Ajax," Timothy said. He kept his eyes on the horse, but there was a slight shift in his posture that she interpreted as acknowledgement. "That seems like a lot of name for a horse still learning to trust." He glanced at her then. "He'll grow into it," he said. It was not much of a conversation, but it was the beginning of one, and in the way that real conversations often begin sideways, through things that are not quite what they are about, it planted something between them that would prove very difficult to uproot. That afternoon, Horace Pemberton came by with a proposition. He came in a buggy, sweating through his good coat, with the expression of a man who has made a mess and is hoping someone else will clean it up. He sat in the parlor and drank Mrs. Aldridge's coffee and explained that Harold Fitch was still interested, that Fitch was a very prosperous man, that the opportunities for a woman of Margaret's situation in a place like Caldwell were not limitless, and that perhaps, with a little more time to consider, "Mr. Pemberton," Margaret said, "I want to be very clear with you. I came here to be a school teacher. If the position no longer exists, I need to know what actually happened, and I need to know whether there are any other teaching opportunities in this town or the surrounding area, because that is what I am equipped to do and what I am willing to do. I am not willing to be sold to Harold Fitch or any other man as part of whatever arrangement you have organized." Pemberton looked at his hat. He looked at the wall. He looked at the door through which Timothy had pointedly not entered, though Margaret was fairly sure he was within earshot. "The schoolteacher position," Pemberton said slowly, "might be reconstituted in the fall if there is sufficient enrollment interest." "That is not an answer," Margaret said. "There's a family out on the Kisham Ranch," he said, even more slowly. "3 children school age. They've been asking about private tutoring. I can make an introduction. It was not what she had come for. It was not the respectable, established position that Pemberton's letter had dangled before her like a lantern in the dark. But it was real, and it was possible, and it was a reason to stay that had nothing to do with Harold Fitch. "Make the introduction," she said. Pemberton left, and Timothy came in from wherever he had been lurking near the hallway and poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down across the kitchen table from her without saying anything for a moment. "You handled that well," he said finally. "He lied to me," she said. "He brought me out here under false pretenses for the benefit of a man who wanted a wife and was too lazy or too unappealing to find one by conventional means." "Yes," Timothy said, with no attempt to soften it. "I am not going back to Boston," she said. He looked at her over the rim of his coffee cup. "I didn't say you should. You have been thinking it." Something crossed his face, not denial, but not quite confirmation either. Something more complicated. "I have been thinking that a woman alone in Caldwell has a harder road than a woman in Boston," he said. "That is not the same thing." "No," she agreed. "It is not." They looked at each other across the kitchen table, and something shifted very slightly in the air between them. Something as subtle as a change in wind direction that you notice not because you can see it, but because your skin tells you the temperature is different. Margaret looked down at her coffee and told herself, very firmly, not to be foolish. The introduction to the Kishom family happened the following morning, and it went better than Margaret had dared to hope. The Kishoms were a ranching family. George Kishom was a weathered, quiet man. His wife Ellen was warm and sensible, and their 3 children, a boy of 10 named Robert and twin girls of 7 named Clara and Louise, were bright and poorly educated and desperately eager for someone to make learning interesting. Margaret sat with them in their front room for 2 hours, assessed what they knew and what they needed, and left with an arrangement to come 3 times a week beginning the following Monday. She had a purpose. She had a reason to stay. She had, provisionally, a life. What she did not have was a place to stay, because it was impossible to impose indefinitely on Timothy Boone's spare room, which she was already aware of, and which Pemberton's visit had made acutely uncomfortable. It was Timothy who solved this, in his direct, quiet way. He came to her that evening before supper with his hat in his hands. She was already learning to read him, and the hat in the hands meant he was about to say something he had thought about carefully, and said that Mrs. Aldridge had mentioned there was a small house near the creek on the edge of the property that had been used as a foreman's cottage and was not currently occupied, and that it was clean and weather-tight, and that if she needed somewhere to stay while she got established, she was welcome to it. Margaret thought about this carefully. It was not entirely proper. It was not Boston proper, anyway. But this was Caldwell, Kansas, in the summer of 1882, and propriety operated on slightly different axes out here, and the alternative was to go back to Boston and resume being graciously tolerated, which she would rather die than do. "What would your neighbors say?" she asked. "The nearest neighbor is 4 miles, he said, "and I don't much care what they say in any case. Mrs. Aldridge would be on the property," she said, working through it aloud. "Every day," he said, "and the Kishom ranch is closer from here than from town." "You are giving me very practical reasons," she said. "I have them," he said. She moved into the foreman's cottage the next morning, and for the next week she taught the Kishom children 3 days a week, and spent the other days exploring the area around the property, and helping Mrs. Aldridge with what little the woman would allow her to help with, and occasionally appearing at the pasture fence to watch Timothy work with his horses. He was always there, doing something purposeful and unhurried, shoeing or mending or working with Ajax on the lead line, or reading through a horse's conformation with his hands, reading for soundness the way Margaret read books, slowly and with attention to what the text was actually saying underneath the surface. They talked more as the days passed. Not long conversations. Timothy was not a man who talked for the sake of filling silence, but real ones. She learned that he had grown up on a small farm in Missouri, the second of 4 sons, that he had come west originally to work on the cattle drives, but had found he preferred horses to cattle, that he had a younger brother named James still in Missouri whom he wrote to occasionally. He learned that she had grown up in a well-off household that had then ceased to be well-off, that she had wanted to be a teacher since she was 8 years old, that she was not afraid of hard work but was extremely afraid of being useless. "You are not useless," he said one evening. They were sitting on the porch of his house. She had started taking her evening coffee on her own porch but somehow had ended up on his watching the light go out of the sky in layers, the horizon going from gold to copper to a deep burning orange. "I was in Boston," she said. "Boston was wrong about you," he said simply, and the plainness of it hit her somewhere near the center of her chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending rings outward. She did not say anything back. She was afraid of what she might say. It was on the 5th day that Harold Fitch came back. He came in the afternoon, when Timothy was in the far pasture and only Mrs. Aldridge was in the main house, and Margaret was alone at the foreman's cottage with a lesson plan spread out on the small table. She heard the hoofbeats and looked out the window and felt her stomach drop when she recognized the man on the horse. Fitch dismounted heavily and knocked on the door with the particular knock of a man who is accustomed to doors opening for him. She opened the door because there was nothing to be gained from refusing. "Miss Easton," he said, looking around the cottage with an expression that combined possessiveness and contempt in roughly equal measure. "Pemberton tells me you've taken up residence on Boone's property." "I have," she said. "People are talking," he said. "People in towns with one hotel that burns down and one boarding house that fills with cattle drovers have very few interesting things to talk about," she said. "I imagine it passes the time." Fitch's face went a color that was not quite red and not quite purple. "I came to make you a fair offer," he said. "My ranch is the largest operation in Sumner County. You'd want for nothing." "I want for very little as it is," Margaret said. "I have a position teaching the Kisham children. I have a cottage. I have what I need." "What you need," Fitch said, and there was something in his voice that made the back of her neck prickle, "is a protector. A woman alone on a man's property, with no family out here, no connections, that is a vulnerable position, Miss Easton, whether you choose to see it or not." "I see it clearly," she said. "I also see that you are here uninvited, suggesting that the vulnerable position you are describing is one you are contributing to by being here at all." She watched the calculation move through Fitch's eyes. He was not stupid, she realized. He was entitled and dismissive and fundamentally unable to see her as a full person, but he was not stupid, and he was reassessing her in a way that she found more alarming than his initial bluster. "Boone can't offer you anything," Fitch said. "His operation is small and he owes on the property." "I was not aware I had asked Mr. Boone to offer me anything," she said. "People are watching," Fitch said. "That's all I'm saying." He left, and Margaret closed the door and stood with her back against it and breathed carefully until the prickling in her neck subsided. That evening she told Timothy. She watched his face go through several things that she was only beginning to learn to read, a tightening around the eyes that she was starting to associate with anger being carefully contained, a stillness in his hands that meant he was choosing words, and then he said with perfect control, "He is not wrong that you are in a vulnerable position out here. He is absolutely wrong that the solution is to marry him," she said. "Yes," Timothy said. "He is wrong about that." "He said you owe on the property," she said, because the remark had lodged in her and she needed to understand it. Timothy's expression did not change. "I do," he said. "I took a bank loan in '78 to expand the pastures. I am paying it down. It is not a crisis." "I did not think it was," she said. "I only thought it seemed like something Fitch would use." Timothy looked at her with that stripped-down expression she was learning to recognize, the one that appeared when he was not going to manage what he was feeling into something more appropriate. "Fitch owns a third of the county council," he said. "He has friends at the bank. He has caused problems for people before who refused him what he wanted." "Is that a warning?" she asked. "It is information," he said. "And what do you suggest I do with this information?" she asked. He was quiet for a long time. The evening sounds of the plains moved around them: crickets, the distant call of a nighthawk, the soft movements of horses in the pasture. "I think," he said finally, "that you should consider going back to Boston." The words landed in the room with a weight that was all out of proportion to their surface meaning, and they both knew it. "Is that what you want?" Margaret asked, and she kept her voice very steady. Timothy stood up from his chair and went to the porch railing and looked out at the darkening pastures, and said nothing for long enough that Margaret's chest began to ache. "It is what makes sense," he said finally. "That is not the same thing," she said, using his own words back at him, the ones he had said about not wanting her to leave and sending her away being different things. He turned to look at her. In the last of the light his face was all shadow and plains, and she could see that he was fighting something, holding something back with the same careful, practiced control he used with the nervous horses, keeping his movements small and consistent so as not to startle anything with a delicate temperament. "No," he said, "it is not." She went back to the cottage that night and lay awake for a long time listening to the plains breathe. The next morning she found that Horace Pemberton had arranged, without consulting her, for Margaret to be on the afternoon stage back to Wichita, with a connection to the eastbound train at the depot there. He arrived at the property with the ticket already purchased, and the particular expression of a man who considers himself to be arranging things for everyone's benefit, and will not be confused by the subject's inconvenient opinions. He had also spoken to Timothy first, she realized, from the way Timothy was standing in the yard when Pemberton's buggy rolled up, standing there with his arms at his sides, and that carved stone look on his face that she now recognized as the expression he wore when he had made a decision he did not entirely believe in. "Pemberton says he has booked you a passage," Timothy said. He did not look at her directly. "Pemberton did not ask me," Margaret said. "Miss Easton," Pemberton said, climbing down from his buggy with the sheaf of papers and the ticket and the air of a man managing a delicate situation, "this is genuinely for your benefit. Fitch is making trouble. He has spoken to Judge Alderman about a complaint regarding the impropriety of your living arrangements here, and while I do not believe it will amount to anything, the suggestion alone can damage your reputation. Going back east is simply the sensible thing." "You brought me out here with a false promise," Margaret said. "You deceived me about the teaching position. You attempted to sell me to Harold Fitch without my knowledge or consent. And now you are booking passage for me as though I am a parcel to be returned to sender. I would like you to understand that I am not a parcel." Pemberton's face worked through several configurations. "Miss Easton, I will consider my options," she said. "I will let you know my decision. Good day, Mr. Pemberton." Pemberton looked at Timothy, who did not look back, and eventually climbed back into his buggy and drove away with the dignity of a man who considers himself to have done his best in very trying circumstances. Margaret and Timothy stood in the yard in the full morning sun, and the silence between them was different from the evening silences on the porch, less comfortable, more charged, full of things pressing against both sides of a dam. "He is right about Fitch making trouble," Timothy said. "I know," she said. "Fitch has real power here. He can make your situation very difficult." "I know that too." "The teaching arrangement with the Kishomes is the Kishomes' decision, not Fitch's," she said sharply. "Fitch holds the note on Kishome's north pasture," Timothy said, and this stopped her. She looked at him. He met her eyes, and the regret in them was naked and unconcealed. "He has already spoken to Kishome," she said. It was not a question. "I don't know," Timothy said. "I don't know that yet." But she could see from his face that he thought it was likely, and she stood in the morning sun in the dust of his yard, and felt the walls closing in, the particular walls of a world run by men like Harold Fitch, who used money and connections the way other men used their hands casually to move things where they wanted them. She went back to the cottage and sat very still at the small table for a long time. That was the morning of the stage. The stage for Wichita departed Caldwell at 2 in the afternoon from the depot on Main Street. Pemberton had purchased a ticket for it. Timothy had, that morning, found reasons to come by the cottage twice. Once about something to do with the water pump that she strongly suspected was not actually about the water pump, and once to bring her a jar of Mrs. Aldridge's preserves, which was so transparently an excuse that she might have found it endearing under different circumstances. She had packed her bag. She had not made a decision, but she had packed her bag, because packing her bag meant she had options, and having options was the only sovereignty left to her. At noon, she sat on the small porch of the cottage and looked at the horse pastures and the enormous sky, and the way the grass moved in the wind like the surface of a slow river, and thought about Boston, the narrow parlor, the gracious tolerance, the careful parade of dull, appropriate men. She thought about Ajax the nervous bay horse learning to trust. She thought about Timothy Boone's face in the last light of the porch, saying, "It is what makes sense," and the way he had not been able to look at her. At 1:30, she picked up her bag and walked to the main house to say goodbye to Mrs. Aldridge, who was in the kitchen doing something with a large pot and looked at Margaret with the frank, assessing gaze she had turned on her since day one. "Going, then," Mrs. Aldridge said. "I think so," Margaret said. Said Mrs. Aldridge, which conveyed a great deal without saying anything specific. Timothy drove her to the depot in the wagon. The ride was 20 minutes of the most charged silence Margaret had ever sat inside of, silence with texture and temperature, silence that pressed against her throat and made it difficult to breathe normally. The wagon seat was narrow enough that their arms were almost touching. She was aware of every inch of distance between them with an acuity that was almost painful. At the depot, she climbed down with her bag and he climbed down, and they stood by the wagon while the stage was loaded, and the driver checked the wheel pins and the other passengers. 2 men and an older woman climbed aboard, and all of it happened around them with the terrible momentum of things in motion that cannot be stopped. Pemberton was there, trying to look helpful. Fitch was not there, which somehow made it worse. His absence meant he had already considered the thing done. The stage was ready. The driver called for boarding. Margaret stood with her bag and looked at Timothy Boone and waited. He looked back at her. His hands were at his sides. His jaw was set. He did not reach for her bag. He did not hand her up into the coach. He did not say go. He did not say stay. He looked at her with that stripped-down, unmanaged expression, the one where nothing was being held back anymore, and he said absolutely nothing at all. The driver called again. Pemberton made a small, encouraging gesture. Margaret looked at the stage door, open and waiting. She looked at Timothy. She put her bag down. The driver, a man named Culpepper who had been driving the Caldwell run for 3 years and had seen stranger things, waited another 30 seconds and then announced that they were departing and rolled the stage door shut and got up on the box and released the brake. And by the time Pemberton had fully registered what was happening, the stage was already moving. They all watched it go. And then there they were, Margaret and Timothy and the red dust, and the August heat and the enormous plains, and the 3 days until the next stage and the something else. Enormous now, unmistakable, sitting in the open air between them, refusing to be packed into any bag and sent east. Timothy walked to the livery to see to the horse. Margaret followed. The livery was quiet and cool relative to the street, smelling of hay and horse, and the particular dusty leather scent that Margaret was already associating with this place, with this man, with the strange, unprecedented feeling of being somewhere she had not expected to be, but which felt, terrifyingly, like the right place. Timothy was unhitching the horse from the wagon when she walked in. He knew she was there. She had learned that about him, that he always knew exactly where she was in any given space, had a kind of peripheral awareness that was not threatening but was extremely thorough. "I need you to tell me the truth," she said. He kept working with the harness. "What truth?" he said with the stillness of a man who knows exactly what truth is being requested. "Why you sent me away," she said. "The real reason, not Fitch, not propriety, not sense, the real reason." The harness came loose. He settled it over the stall rail and stood with his back to her for a moment, and she watched his shoulders make a slow movement that was something like a breath, let go of something it had been holding too long. He turned around. "Because I did not trust myself," he said. The words were quiet and entirely undefended. "Trusted yourself to do what?" she asked. "To let you leave," he said. She stood in the quiet of the livery while the hay dust drifted in the light coming through the high window and the horse moved peacefully in the stall, and she let that settle over her the way you let yourself feel something real after a long time of not allowing it. "Timothy," she said. "I know," he said. "I know what I am saying, and I know what it means that I did not put you on that stage." "What does it mean?" she asked because she needed to hear him say it. He came toward her slowly, with the same deliberate, unhurried movement he used with the nervous horses, giving her every opportunity to step back, to refuse, to leave the space between them wide and managed and safe. She did not step back. He stopped close enough that she could see the detail of his eyes, very dark, steadier than she had ever seen eyes be, and said, "It means I am in love with you. I have been since about the third morning, if I'm being honest, which I should have been sooner." Margaret Easton, who had crossed 1,000 miles on a false promise and refused Harold Fitch twice, and held her ground against Pemberton, and stood her place while the stage rolled away without her, felt her throat go tight with something that was not quite crying but was immediately adjacent to it. "That is a problem," she said. "I know," he said. "Because I am also in love with you," she said. "And I have been trying very hard to be sensible about it." The corner of his mouth moved. It was almost a smile. "How has that been going?" "Terribly," she said. "I didn't get on the stage." And then Timothy Boone did reach for her, slowly and with the same care he used for everything, his hands coming up to cup her face with a gentleness that was entirely at odds with the size and calloused roughness of them. And she put her hands against his chest and felt his heart beating fast beneath her palms, which was the most honest thing she had ever felt, and she thought, with sudden perfect clarity, that she was done being sensible. He kissed her in the quiet of the livery while the horse stood peacefully in the stall, and the August light came through the window in long golden bars, and it was not the dramatic, swept-off-her-feet kind of kiss that her aunt's parlor novels had led her to believe was the proper form. It was something steadier and truer than that, something with the quality of a decision made after careful thought and at great cost, and for exactly the right reasons. When it ended, she stayed where she was, her forehead against his jaw, and said, "There is still the problem of Fitch." "Yes," he said, "and Pemberton." "Yes, and the next stage in 3 days." He pulled back enough to look at her, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen before, open and unheld, the last of the carved stone completely gone, and he said, "I would like very much for you to not be on it." "What would that mean?" she asked. "It would mean," he said, "that you stay, that we figure out what that looks like, that I am honest with you and you are honest with me, and we do not pretend that sending you back east is the sensible thing when neither of us believes it." "It would mean dealing with Fitch," she said. "I know how to deal with Fitch," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not aggressive but was absolutely certain, the voice of a man who has thought this through and is not afraid of it. "Tell me," she said. He stepped back, took her hand, and led her out of the livery into the light. What Timothy knew about Harold Fitch that Pemberton did not know he knew, because Timothy Boone was a man who listened more than he talked, and therefore gathered information that louder people missed, was that Fitch's land claim on his north quarter section was improperly filed. There had been a surveying dispute in 1879, when the boundary lines in that part of Sumner County had been redrawn following the railroad's right-of-way purchase. Fitch had used his connections on the county council to get the redrawn boundaries filed in his favor, but the original survey documents still existed at the federal land office in Wichita, and they showed a discrepancy of about 40 acres that Fitch had absorbed without the required secondary filing. It was not the most dramatic secret. It was not the kind of dark past that would destroy a man overnight. But it was the kind of irregularity that the Federal Land Office took very seriously, the kind that could result in a formal review, the kind that would tie up Fitch's northern expansion in legal complications for a year or more, and more importantly, make it very clear to Fitch that the information existed and that someone had it. Timothy had learned about it from a land surveyor named Peters who had done work on the county lines in 1879, and who was still quietly furious about what Fitch had pressured the council into doing. Peters had mentioned it to Timothy over a drink at Milligan's saloon 6 months ago, not as a weapon but as a complaint, the way men complain about injustice when there seems to be nothing to be done about it. Timothy had filed it away. He had not been sure what he would do with it. He knew now. He rode to Fitch's ranch the following morning alone, with the original survey documents that Peters had kept copies of, and that Timothy had, with Peters's blessing, borrowed the previous afternoon. He was back by noon. He would not tell Margaret everything that was said in that meeting. He told her that he had made it clear to Fitch that the Federal Land Office in Wichita could become aware of certain filing irregularities, and that Fitch had said some things that were not worth repeating, and that in the end, Fitch had understood that it was not in his interest to pursue any complaint against Margaret or any pressure on the Kisham family's note, and that the matter was concluded. "Is it really concluded?" Margaret asked. "Men like Fitch back down when they think they've lost the advantage," Timothy said. "He has lost the advantage. He will not come after you again." "And Pemberton will do as Fitch does," Timothy said. "He has no independent motivation in this." He was acting on Fitch's behalf. Margaret sat with this. Outside the kitchen window the afternoon was clear and golden, and somewhere in the pasture Ajax was probably running the perimeter with his ears up, practicing being brave. "You did that for me," she said. "I did it because it was right," Timothy said. "Fitch has been using that surveying irregularity as a private advantage for 3 years. It was not right." "Timothy," he looked at her. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once in the direct, unembellished way he had, and poured himself coffee. The next 3 days before the stage ran again were extraordinary in their ordinary quality. No one tried to send Margaret anywhere. Pemberton did not come back. Fitch did not appear on the road. The world seemed to have rearranged itself into something survivable. Margaret went to the Kisham ranch and taught the children their lessons, and found that Ellen Kisham had in fact been approached by Fitch's man about the note on the north pasture, but that the man had subsequently come back and said there had been a change of plans and the matter was not urgent. Ellen Kisham was shrewd enough to know that something had happened and gracious enough not to press for details, and she gave Margaret a jar of wild plum jam and said the children were doing wonderfully with their letters. Timothy worked with his horses, and in the evenings they sat on the main house porch and talked in the way they had discovered they could talk honestly, without the management and containment that both of them had been performing for the first week, about what they wanted and what frightened them, and what they thought about the future. Margaret told him about her father's business failing, and the 3 years of gracious tolerance, and the particular quality of invisibility that came from being a woman with education and capability, and no money and no husband, the way the world looked through you, as though the absence of money and a husband made you not quite real. He listened to all of it with the full attention he gave everything, without trying to fix it or minimize it or redirect it, which was the rarest and most valuable kind of listening. He told her about Missouri, about the farm and the father who had worked himself to death before Timothy turned 15, and the years after when the farm went under and the family scattered, and coming west in 1875 with enough money for a horse and a bedroll and a 6-month head start of grim determination. He had worked a cattle drive from Abilene to Dodge City, then another season on the Kisham Trail north from Texas, and it was on that second drive that he had started paying serious attention to the horses rather than the cattle, to the particular intelligence and honesty of horses, the way they never dissembled, never had a hidden motive, gave you exactly what they were feeling with no intermediary. "Is that why you trust them more than people?" Margaret asked. "I trust people," he said. "I trust them when they earn it." "How do you earn it?" she asked. He looked at her. "By not running," he said simply. "By staying when staying is harder than going." The second evening, he asked her if she would consider marrying him. He asked it the way he did most things, without elaborate preamble, without manufacturing a particular romantic atmosphere, just directly and honestly across the kitchen table, with the remnants of supper between them and the evening light going golden through the windows, and his hat on the chair beside him and his dark eyes steady and serious. "I am asking because I want to," he said. "Not because of fitch or respectability or any external reason. I want you here. I want this to be your home. I want to be your home if that is something you want." Margaret looked at him for a long time. She thought about what it meant to say yes to a man in 1882 in Kansas, the legal reality of it, the way a woman's property and personhood became subsumed under law, the things she was giving up. She thought about these things with the full, clear-eyed honesty she had applied to every major decision of her life, not hiding from the difficulty of it. She also thought about Ajax learning to trust, about the porch in the evenings and the golden light, about the feeling of his hands on her face in the livery, the heart beating fast beneath her palms. "I want to teach," she said. "I need that to be understood. The Kishom children for now and more children as we can manage it. I want to build a proper school here. That is not a hobby or a pastime, it is what I am, and it matters to me as much as the horses matter to you." "I know that," he said without any sign of surprise. "And I want to be a partner," she said. "Not a household ornament, a real partner in what you are building here." "I would not want you any other way," he said. "Then yes," she said. "Yes, Timothy." The smile that moved across his face was the kind that starts in the eyes and takes its time reaching the rest of the features, unhurried and entirely genuine, and it was the most beautiful thing Margaret had seen in a long time. They were married in the first week of September, 1882, by the circuit preacher who came through Caldwell every 6 weeks, in a small ceremony in the main house with Mrs. Aldridge as witness and George and Ellen Kishom, and their children making up the rest of the congregation. Margaret wore her second-best dress, which was blue, and Robert Kishom, aged 10 and extremely proud of himself, provided 2 wildflowers he had gathered from the creek bank, slightly wilted but earnestly presented. It was not a grand occasion. It was not meant to be. It was, Margaret thought, standing beside Timothy and looking at the simple, genuine happiness in the room around her, exactly what a wedding was supposed to be. They spent their first evening as married people sitting on the porch, watching the stars come out over the Kansas plains, which in the late summer are so numerous and so bright that the sky looks lit from behind. And Timothy told her the names of the constellations in the unhurried way he told her everything. And she thought that this was what it felt like to be home, not a place you were born into or assigned to, but a place you had chosen under full understanding of the cost. The fall came on quickly and beautifully, the heat breaking in September and the grass going golden, and the sky turning that particular shade of high plains blue that has no match anywhere else Margaret had ever been. She threw herself into the teaching with the focused energy she had been storing up for 3 years in the Beacon Street parlor, and the Kishom children thrived visibly, Robert leaping ahead in arithmetic and Clara developing a passionate interest in history, and Louise, quiet and fierce, turning out to have a gift for language that Margaret recognized with a jolt of pure joy as something that needed nurturing badly and immediately. She wrote to the county school board in October proposing a formal school district for the Caldwell area. She received a polite non-committal response, which she treated as an opening, and wrote back with enrollment projections and curriculum proposals, and a budget that she had worked out with Timothy at the kitchen table on 3 successive evenings. Timothy, for his part, was in the middle of the busiest season of his year. The Army had placed an order for 20 horses in October, and he and his 2 part-time hired hands, A young man named Declan and an older one named Willis were working long days to have them ready. Margaret learned the rhythms of a working horse operation with the same rapid absorption she brought to everything, and by the end of October she could assess a horse's soundness from across a pasture and could identify the particular quality of attention in Ajax's ear set that meant he was deciding whether to trust the situation. Ajax, it turned out, was a horse of exceptional intelligence and deep personal opinion, and he had decided, at some point in October, that Margaret was acceptable. She had been standing at the fence one morning when he had walked over without being called and put his nose against her shoulder with a deliberateness that made it clearly intentional rather than accidental. "He likes you," Timothy said from where he was working nearby. "I like him," she said. "He doesn't like most people," Timothy said, and there was something in his voice that was not just about the horse. November brought the first cold, a sharp change that swept down from the north in a single day and turned the air crisp and clean, and transformed the landscape from gold to brown almost overnight. Margaret and Timothy settled into the particular intimacy of people who share a home and a life and a bed and a vision of the future, the small daily closeness that is different from the drama of beginning and is in many ways more precious. The morning coffee and the evening light, and the conversations that range from the practical to the philosophical without apparent transition, the shorthand of two people learning each other's rhythms. She loved him in a way she had not expected love to feel, not the consuming, disorienting passion of the novels her aunt kept in her parlor, but something more structural and sustaining, like load-bearing timber, something that held the whole thing up. In December, Horace Pemberton came to see her. He came alone, without Fitch, and without the air of a man doing someone else's bidding. He sat in the kitchen and accepted Mrs. Aldridge's coffee and turned his hat in his hands, and eventually said that he had behaved badly and was sorry for it. Margaret looked at him. He was a small, fluttery man with good instincts that he consistently overrode with bad choices, and she thought he probably knew that about himself and found it uncomfortable to live with. "Why did you really bring me out here?" she asked. "The real reason." Pemberton was quiet for a moment. "Fitch was my largest client," he said. "Fitch wanted a wife, and I had your letter, and I told myself it would work out, that you would see the sense of it. And when I did not see the sense of it," she asked, "I kept thinking you would come around," he said. "And then when it was clear you were not going to, I did not know how to undo what I had set in motion. Sending you back east seemed like the cleanest solution for everyone." "For you and for Fitch," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am sorry." Margaret looked at him for a long time. She thought about the injustice of it, being moved around like a piece on a board game. Her life and her choices treated as factors to be managed, rather than as her own sovereign territory. She felt the anger of it, which was real and justified, and she did not intend to minimize it. She also looked at the small, uncomfortable man sitting in her kitchen turning his hat in his hands and saying the hardest words most people can manage, which are, "I was wrong and I am sorry." "I accept your apology," she said. "I do not excuse what you did, but I accept the apology." Pemberton nodded, with the look of a man setting down a weight he has been carrying for months. "There is," he said, gathering himself, "something that might be of interest to you. The county has been discussing formally establishing a school district for the Caldwell area. They received your proposal in November." "I sit on the advisory board," he paused. "I recommended it." Margaret looked at him sharply. "It will not compensate for what I did," he said quickly. "I know that, but it is something I can do that is right, and I did it." It took another 2 months. The county moved with the particular slow deliberation of bodies that have many competing interests and not enough money. But in February of 1883, Margaret received a letter informing her that the Caldwell Consolidated School District had been formally established, with a budget for a school building to be constructed in the spring, and a salary for a teacher commencing with the fall term of 1883. She read the letter at the kitchen table, and then she put it down, and she covered her face with her hands, and she cried, not from sadness, but from the particular overwhelming feeling of a thing you have wanted for a long time becoming real. Timothy came in from the pasture to find her this way and crossed the kitchen in about 4 steps and put his arms around her and held on, and she let him. And when she could speak, she told him what the letter said. "You did that," he said. "Pemberton helped," she said. "You did that," he said again. "You wrote those letters and made those arguments, and you did not stop when they didn't answer, and you built this." She turned in his arms and looked at his face, and the pride in it, not the possessive pride of a man whose wife has done something that reflects well on him, but the genuine, uncomplicated pride of someone watching a person they love achieve what they deserve, undid her in a way she had not expected. "We built this," she said. He kissed her forehead very gently. "We built this," he agreed. Spring came with the particular extravagance of the Kansas plains, the whole world going green almost overnight, wildflowers running in waves across the grassland, the creek running full and clear with snowmelt from the mountains to the west. Ajax came into full health and brilliance. The nervous bay horse of the previous summer transformed into a confident, gleaming animal who stood at the fence waiting for Margaret on the mornings. She came by and accepted pieces of apple from her hand, with the dignified air of someone graciously accepting tribute that was his due. The school building went up in April and May, a simple but solid structure on the east edge of town, built mostly by volunteer labor from the families who had children who would attend. Timothy organized the work parties with quiet efficiency, supplying lumber from a mill in Wichita at cost and contributing more personal labor than anyone kept track of. The day the building was finished, doors hung, windows set, a proper iron stove in the corner, and a blackboard on the front wall. Margaret walked through it alone in the late afternoon and ran her hand along the desks and breathed in the smell of new wood and chalk dust, and the particular clean smell of possibility, and she felt complete in a way she had never quite felt before. She was carrying their first child by then. She had known since late February, confirmed by the doctor in Wichita on a trip Timothy had arranged carefully and without fuss, and the pregnancy was progressing well, the baby expected in October. They had told Mrs. Aldrich first, who had said in a tone that managed to convey both congratulations and "I saw that coming," and a suggestion that she would be knitting something before Timothy had finished his sentence. The summer of 1883 was the fullest Margaret had ever lived. She taught through June and the first part of July, helping the Kishom children consolidate everything they had learned in preparation for entering the school district in the fall. She worked on the school district's curriculum materials in the evenings, a comprehensive set of readers and arithmetic exercises that she designed herself, drawing on everything she had learned in Boston about pedagogy and on the specific needs of children growing up on working ranches in the Kansas grassland, who needed to know history and letters and numbers, but who also needed those things taught in ways that made sense against the actual world they inhabited. Timothy's horse operation had expanded through the year. The Army contract had been renewed and expanded, and he had hired a third hand and brought in a new mare from Missouri who was producing excellent foals. The property was thriving, not in the flashy way of Fitch's vast operation, but in the durable way of things built on honest work and good judgment, a foundation that did not depend on taking advantage of anyone else's weakness. They had a disagreement in August, their first real one, the kind that goes deeper than a surface irritation and requires more than a cool night to resolve. It was about risk. Margaret had been approached by a group of families living 30 miles northwest of Caldwell, past the Salt Fork of the Arkansas River, who had no school for their children, and wondered if she would come to them 2 days a week in addition to her work in Caldwell. She wanted to say yes. Timothy was concerned about her traveling 30 miles by wagon in the final months of a pregnancy over terrain that was not always safe. "It is not about your capability," he said, and she could see he was being careful, and she gave him credit for it. "It is about the distance and the road conditions, and the fact that if something went wrong you would be a long way from help." If I say no now, those children will have nothing for another year, she said. A year matters when you are 8 and cannot read. I know that, he said, and if I do not establish the connection now, the moment passes. By next year they may have found someone else or given up on the idea, and a community that gives up on the idea of a school is very hard to reinvigorate. Margaret, Timothy, they looked at each other across the kitchen in the August heat. What if I drove you, he said. The 2 days you would go, I drive you there and back. She looked at him. That is 40 miles of your time twice a week. Willis can manage the routine work, he said. Declan is solid now. And these are not forever conditions, only until October, when you'll need to stop the travel regardless. She considered this. It was a real compromise, not a capitulation on either side, but a solution that acknowledged both of their concerns honestly. Yes, she said. All right. He drove her to the Northwest settlement 8 times over the course of August and September, 40 miles twice a week, sitting beside her on the wagon seat in the early mornings, with the plains still cool and pink-lit from the dawn, the horses moving at a good steady pace, and those morning drives became some of the most beloved hours of her life. The two of them side by side in the opening light, talking or not talking. The enormous sky above them and the grass all around, and the quiet sense of two people moving together in the same direction for the same reasons. Their son was born on the 14th of October, 1883, at dawn, in the bedroom of the main house with the midwife from town in attendance and Mrs. Aldridge, a reliable and calm presence in the hallway. He was healthy and vocal, and had a ferocious, determined quality from the first hour that made Margaret laugh through her exhaustion, and made Timothy stand at the window for a long moment looking out at the morning, with a stillness that was the closest she had seen him come to being overwhelmed. They named him Daniel after Timothy's father, whom he had loved and lost too young, and whom he had once described to Margaret in an evening conversation as a man who worked himself to exhaustion for his family, and asked nothing back and deserved more than he got. And Margaret had said, without hesitation, that that was a name worth giving to a son. Daniel James Boone came into the world on a golden October morning, with the plains rustling outside the window, and his parents' whole future rearranged around his existence. The fall school term opened on the 1st of November, 1883, with 14 students ranging in age from 6 to 13, and Margaret taught them from her chair in the first weeks, not yet ready for a full day on her feet, with Daniel in a basket in the corner of the schoolroom that she had arranged with Mrs. Aldridge's help, and which Mrs. Aldridge herself came to monitor during school hours. A fact that Margaret suspected had more to do with wanting to be near the baby than any concern about professional propriety. The students were a revelation. 14 children from 7 different families, ranging from the long-established Kishome brood to the recently arrived Ray's family, whose parents had come north from Texas 3 years ago and whose 2 children, a boy of 8 named Thomas and a girl of 11 named Elena, were the fastest learners Margaret had ever taught. Elena in particular, demonstrating a mathematical aptitude that stopped Margaret cold one morning, when she casually solved a problem that most adults in Caldwell could not have worked through. She wrote a letter to a teacher's college in Kansas City about Elena Ray's in November, the first of what would eventually become a sustained effort to identify and support the most exceptional students in the district, and help them find pathways beyond what Caldwell alone could offer. Harold Fitch made one final appearance in November. He came to the school, not to the house which Margaret recognized as a deliberate choice, a message about territory, and stood in the doorway after the children had gone home with his hat in his hands and his big frame diminished somehow, the bluster gone out of him. He was not pleasant. He was not apologetic. But he was, Margaret thought, something she had not expected, honest. "You built a school," he said. "I did," she said. "I did not think you would stay," he said. "I know," she said. He looked around the classroom with the look of a man reassessing a situation he has misjudged. Fitch County will need schools, he said eventually. The railroad is bringing families. Yes, she said, it is. I have land I am not using on the west side, he said. I am not offering it as he stopped. I am not offering it in exchange for anything. I am stating that if the school district needs to expand, there is land available, and I have no interest in being the man who stood in the way of children getting educated. Margaret looked at him for a moment. She thought about the injustice he had done her, and the power he had wielded, and the way he had looked at her at the depot, appraising her like livestock. She thought about the fact that people were not only their worst decisions, even if their worst decisions caused real harm that should not be minimized. I will speak to the school board, she said. The offer will be evaluated on its merits. Fitch nodded once and left. She told Timothy that evening, and he listened carefully and then said, "What do you think his motivation is?" "Legacy, I think," she said. "He is 54 and alone and has a great deal of money and very little that he made which will outlast him. A school is something that outlasts you." Timothy was quiet for a moment. "What will you do?" "Use the land if the terms are acceptable," she said. "The children need the school regardless of his motivation." He looked at her with the open, unheld expression that was still the most precious thing she had seen on anyone's face. "You are extraordinary," he said. "I am practical," she said. "Both," he said. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was a good one, not without hardship, because Kansas winters never are, but a season of warmth inside against the cold outside, the house full of the particular life of a new family finding its shape. Daniel was an active, curious infant who watched everything with enormous dark eyes, Timothy's eyes, Margaret thought, with the same steady quality of attention, and who announced his needs with a decisiveness that she found both exhausting and delightful. Timothy was a father with the same quality he brought to everything present, patient, unhurried. He got up in the night when Daniel woke without being asked, and she would hear him in the dark, the low murmur of his voice, no particular words, just sound, the same kind of low, steady sound he made with the horses when they were frightened, and it was one of the most beautiful sounds she had ever heard. Mrs. Aldridge announced in January that she was going to live with her daughter in Wichita, who had recently had twins and needed help. The announcement was given in the straightforward tone in which she delivered all news, and was followed by a list of instructions for maintaining the household that was comprehensive enough to suggest Mrs. Aldridge had been composing it for some time. She left in February with a single trunk and a departure hug administered to Margaret with surprising fierceness, and a handshake for Timothy that lasted several seconds longer than his handshakes with other people. The house was quieter without her and also more fully theirs, and Margaret found that she had learned enough from watching Mrs. Aldridge work to manage without her, and that managing without her was satisfying in its own right. Spring of 1884 brought new foals in the pasture and new students enrolling in the school, and a letter from Margaret's aunt in Boston that was, for the first time in the correspondence between them, something that could reasonably be called warm. The aunt had apparently been following the development of the Caldwell school district through letters Margaret had been writing all along, informative, detailed letters about the work and the place and the life, not the duty correspondence of a guilty absence, but the genuine sharing of someone who wanted a witness. And the letter in April said that she thought Margaret had done something impressive, and that she wished she had encouraged her differently. It was not an apology. Her aunt was not the apologizing kind. But it was as close as her aunt came, and Margaret read it at the kitchen table with Daniel on her hip, and felt the old hurt of those 3 years soften into something more manageable. She wrote back a long letter with a miniature portrait of Daniel that Timothy had had done in Wichita, and described the school and the plains in spring, and what it felt like to be exactly where you were supposed to be, and did not say any of the sharp things she might have said 2 years ago, because they were no longer necessary. In May of 1884, Timothy suggested expanding the horse operation in a direction he had been thinking about for 2 years. breeding a specific line of horses suited to the demands of working ranches in the Southwest. Animals with the stamina to handle the heat and the terrain and the long days of cattle work, crossed from the best of the Spanish-descended horses already in the region with northern bloodlines that brought in durability and cold tolerance. It was ambitious and would require capital and would take several years to show results. He laid it out for her at the kitchen table with a sketch and a budget, and the patient, careful manner of someone who has thought it through completely. "What does this need from me?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. "Your opinion, your eye, you see things in the horses that I miss because I'm too close to them." She looked at the sketch. "You are not too close to them," she said. "You see them very clearly. You just think 2 steps further ahead than most people, and it sometimes makes you second-guess what you already know." He looked at her for a moment. "Is that what I do?" "It is what you do," she said. "You are very good at what you do, Timothy." "You should trust it," he nodded slowly. "Then you think it is sound?" "I think it is very sound," she said. "And I think if Ajax is any indication of what you can produce when you have the right foundation to work from, people will come from 100 miles to buy what you breed." He signed the papers for a new breeding stallion at the end of May, a rangy gray with excellent conformation from a ranch in New Mexico, and they named him Agamemnon, which caused everyone who heard it to have a brief expression of confusion followed by reluctant respect. The summer of 1884 was busy and full. The school district had grown to include 3 families from the Northwest settlement and 2 new homesteading families who had arrived in the spring, and Margaret was already planning a second classroom. Alina Reyes, now 12, was doing mathematics 3 years beyond her age, and Margaret had been corresponding with the Teachers College in Kansas City about an accelerated program. The response had been cautious but not negative, which Margaret treated as encouraging. She was expecting their second child by July, due the following February, and the pregnancy was straightforward, and she worked through the summer with the same energy she brought to everything, slightly adapted. One evening in August, she and Timothy were sitting on the porch in the late light, still their ritual, the porch in the evenings, the sky going through its colors, and Daniel was asleep inside, and the horses were quiet in the pasture, and Ajax was a distant gleaming shape near the creek. And Timothy said out of the comfortable silence, "Do you ever think about Boston?" "Sometimes," she said. "Do you ever think about Missouri?" "Sometimes," he said. "What do you think about when you think about it?" she asked. "About my brothers," he said. "About my father. About what it would have been like if the farm had survived." He paused. "Mostly I think about how I would not be here if any of those things had gone differently, and here is where I want to be." "Yes," she said. "Do you miss it?" he asked. "Boston." She considered this honestly, the way she tried to consider everything. "I miss the library," she said. "The Boston Public Library. I used to go on Saturdays. It had everything." "I will order you books," he said. "Whatever you want, any library you can name." She looked at him. "Timothy, you should have whatever books you want," he said, with the simple certainty he brought to things he had decided. "We can build a room for them." She laughed, a full, real laugh that startled the horses in the near pasture into brief, attentive stillness. "You want to build me a library?" "I want to build you whatever you need," he said. "That is not a performance. That is just true." She put her head on his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the going dark of the Kansas plains and watched the stars come out the way they had on their first night as married people. Those same extravagant plain stars that looked lit from behind. And she thought that she would take a library over the Boston Public Library, here on this porch with this man, without a moment's hesitation. He built it the following spring, in 1885, a small room off the east side of the house with good shelves and 2 east-facing windows to catch the morning reading light. And Margaret filled it systematically and lovingly over the next several years, until it became the thing that visitors to the Boone property remarked upon with either admiration or confusion, depending on their relationship to books. Their second child, a girl, was born in February of 1885. in the same bedroom with the same midwife and a February blizzard providing dramatic exterior accompaniment. She was healthy and furious, and had a head of dark hair and an opinion about everything from the first hour. They named her Frances Ellen Francis for Timothy's mother and Ellen for Ellen Kishome, who had been among the first genuine kindnesses of Margaret's life in Caldwell, and who wept when told. Daniel, 18 months old, regarded his sister with the serious attention of someone encountering a new and complex phenomenon that requires significant analysis before any conclusion can be drawn. By the spring of 1885, the Caldwell Consolidated School District had 22 students, a second classroom, and a reputation in Sumner County that had traveled further than Margaret had expected. Families settling in the area were asking about the school before they had fully decided where to put their houses. The curriculum materials she had developed were being used, in modified form, by 2 other small school districts in the county, a development that she found both gratifying and mildly alarming, because she had not written them for export and kept finding things she wanted to revise. Elena Reyes began attending the Teachers' College in Kansas City in the fall of 1885, the first student from the Caldwell district to do so, sponsored by a small scholarship that Margaret had organized with characteristic relentlessness through a combination of a letter-writing campaign and a fundraising supper that the entire town had turned out for. Elena came back for Christmas and stood in the schoolroom running her hand along the desks with the same gesture Margaret had made on the day the building was finished. And Margaret understood from the expression on her face that the work was correct, that it was doing what it was supposed to do. The horse breeding program began to show results in 1885 and 1886. Agamemnon's first foal crop demonstrating exactly the qualities Timothy had predicted: rangy, tough, enduring, with a quality of willingness that good working horses need, and that cannot be manufactured, only bred for carefully over time. Ranchers from southern Kansas and northern Texas were coming to see the horses, and the reputation Timothy Boone's stock was building was the quiet, durable kind that depends on the horses actually being as good as advertised, which they were. Fitch's offer of land on the west side had been evaluated by the school board in 1884 and accepted on terms that gave the district clear title, and a third classroom was planned for 1886. Fitch attended the school board meeting at which this was decided and said nothing, but Margaret caught him watching the room with an expression she recognized. A man calculating what his legacy will be, running the numbers on what he has built versus what he has merely purchased, and she thought of what she had said to Timothy, that people were not only their worst decisions, and she hoped the calculation was coming out to something instructive. James Boone, Timothy's younger brother from Missouri, came to visit in the summer of 1886. A lean, sandy-haired man 5 years Timothy's junior with the same quality of unhurried directness, and an infectious humor that his brother lacked but clearly appreciated. He stayed 3 weeks and played with Daniel, who was 3½ and in love with horses, and held Frances Ellen for longer than most grown men hold infants without looking uncomfortable. He told Margaret on his last evening that he had been worried about Timothy. "Worried?" she asked. "He has a quality," James said, choosing words with the Boone care, "of making himself necessary to things and to people and not," he paused, "of not letting himself be needed back, of building things but not quite believing he belongs in them." Margaret looked at him. "I know," she said. "You changed that," James said. She thought about this for a moment. "He changed himself," she said. "I just refused to let him send me away." James smiled. It was Timothy's smile at a slightly different angle. "That's what I mean," he said. James came back the following summer, and the summer after that, and eventually he came for good, buying a small property 10 miles east of the Boone Ranch and running his own cattle operation, and becoming the kind of nearby family that made a life in a new place feel properly rooted, with someone to call on and to be called by, someone who knew the history. In 1887, Margaret received an invitation to speak at the Kansas State Teachers Association annual meeting in Topeka about developing school districts in rural areas. She went, with Timothy and Daniel and Frances Ellen in tow, and she gave a speech that was direct and specific, and that made several administrators in the audience uncomfortable in the precise way that direct and specific speeches about things that need to change always do. She was invited back the following year, and the year after that. She became, in the particular unhurried way that her husband built his horse reputation, someone that the state educational establishment had to reckon with, not flashy, not political in the ordinary sense, but deeply informed and entirely unwilling to be managed into imprecision. Timothy watched her speak at the 1889 association meeting from the back of the hall with Daniel, now 6, and managing his formal attire with put-upon dignity, and Frances Ellen, who was 4, and had already asked 6 questions about the ceiling of the Topeka meeting hall. He watched Margaret at the podium with the full, still attention he gave to things he loved, and when she finished and the applause filled the hall, he did not clap loudly or make any demonstration. He just stood at the back with the children and looked at her with the open, unheld expression, the one with nothing managed down, and Margaret, scanning the room for him instinctively as she always did, found him and felt the answering warmth in her chest that had never, in 7 years, decreased even slightly. Daniel started in the Caldwell school in the fall of 1889, the son of the school teacher, which created its own interesting dynamic that Margaret navigated with humor and Timothy watched with amusement from a careful distance. Daniel was serious and steady, like his father, and had an aptitude for mathematics that he clearly had not inherited from either parent, which Margaret found fascinating and Timothy found entirely plausible. Frances Ellen would start 2 years later and would turn out to be the student who most resembled her mother, relentless, fast, and possessed of strong opinions about how things should be done, that she communicated without significant concern for tact. In 1890, Timothy paid off the last of the bank loan he had taken in 1878. He told Margaret this at supper without particular ceremony in the plain way he reported facts. She put down her fork and looked at him. The whole note, he said. The property is clear, she said. The property is clear, he confirmed. She got up and went around the table and sat on his lap and put her arms around his neck, and he put his face against her hair, and they stayed like that for a while in the kitchen in the evening light, with the planes moving outside the windows and the horses quiet in the pasture, and Daniel's voice drifting from somewhere in the house and Frances Ellen's louder voice answering him, and the library on the east side of the house full of books, and the school a mile away in town with its 3 classrooms and its 28 students, and the smell of chalk dust that Margaret had loved since she was 8 years old. "We built this," she said quietly against his shoulder. "We built this," he said back. In the spring of 1891, Margaret discovered she was expecting a 3rd child. This came as a surprise to both of them and was received with a particular quality of happiness less anxious than the first, less wondering than the second, the happiness of people who know what they have and recognize when more of it is arriving. Their 3rd child, another boy, was born in November of 1891 and was named William, after no particular person, but simply because it was a good name that both of them liked. And he arrived in the world with the same decisive quality as Frances Ellen, and immediately began demonstrating an intense interest in animals that suggested he was going to be spending a great deal of time in the horse pasture. Timothy took on a new apprentice in 1892, a young man named Abel Cross who came from a family in the Northwest Settlement, one of Margaret's original 2-days-a-week students, now 19 and possessed of a genuine gift, with horses that Timothy recognized immediately, and set about cultivating with the patience and attention he gave to everything worth developing. Abel became in time one of the best horsemen in the county, and he was the first of what would eventually become a steady stream of young people from the Northwest settlement who came to the Boone operation to learn, making it the kind of place where knowledge was passed on deliberately. 1892 was also the year that Alina Reyes, now 20, completed her teacher's college program and returned to Caldwell to take over the primary grades from Margaret, who had been teaching alone for 9 years and was ready, without fully acknowledging it until Alina arrived, to hand the younger children to someone capable and focus her own teaching on the older students and on the curriculum work she had been doing increasingly for the state association. Alina and Margaret spent a week in August going through the curriculum materials and the student records and the particular knowledge that accumulates in a teacher's understanding of a community's children who needed what, where the gaps were, which families had more difficulty at home than they showed at school, where the exceptional students were, and what they needed that the standard curriculum could not give them. It was a transfer of knowledge of the deepest kind, and when it was done, Alina looked at the accumulated mass of it and said, quietly, "You built something real here." "We built something real," Margaret said, using the same formulation she always used. Alina was young, but she was not naive. She looked at Margaret with the particular clear-eyed assessment of someone who had been taught by this woman for years and had learned to see what she was actually doing underneath what she appeared to be doing. "You and Mr. Boone," she said. "This town, this school, all of it." "Yes," Margaret said, "all of it." She walked home that afternoon in the September light with the full, rounded feeling of something that has come to fruition, something planted in the red dust of a stage depot in August of 1882, with a bag on the ground, and a stage rolling away, and 2 people standing still in the open air refusing to do the sensible thing. That evening she found Timothy at the pasture fence, the familiar posture, forearms on the rail, looking out at the horses in the late light. Ajax, older now and gray at the muzzle but still magnificent, stood nearby with the composed authority of an elder statesman. She stood beside Timothy at the fence and put her arm through his and looked out at the horses in the going gold light. "Do you remember," she said, "what you told me about Ajax, that you named him what he would grow into?" "I remember," he said. "Do you think we did that?" she asked. "Built into what we would grow into." He was quiet for a moment, the plains-wide quiet that was his natural element. "I think," he said, "that you walked into a livery and asked me for the truth, and I gave it to you, and that is when we started growing into it." She pressed her forehead against his shoulder. "I almost got on the stage," she said. "I know," he said. "I packed my bag," she said. "I know," he said. "I saw it from the yard." She pulled back to look at him. "And you still did not come after me." "I did not want to hold you somewhere you did not choose freely," he said. "I could not, it would not have been right, to stand between you and the stage if that was what you wanted. I could only not make you get on it if you were not ready." She looked at the side of his face in the September light, the strong profile and the dark eyes and the hat brim and the steady, unhurried quality of a man who had been doing the right thing, quietly and without fanfare, for so long it had simply become what he was. "I love you," she said. He turned to look at her. The smile was there, the slow one that started in the eyes. "I love you," he said, "since about the 3rd morning, if we are being precise." She laughed, and he caught her against him and held on with the permanent, unhurried certainty of a man who has made a decision he believes in completely and has never once second-guessed it. Behind them, the main house sat solid and well lit in the September evening, with the library on the east side, and the sound of Daniel's voice drifting from somewhere inside, and Frances Ellen answering and William almost certainly doing something inadvisable near the horse barn. The school was a mile away with its 3 classrooms, and the smell of chalk dust, and the desks that Margaret had run her hand along on the first day, and recognized as the shape of what she had always wanted. The horses moved in the golden pasture light, Agamemnon's foals among them, leggy and strong and built for the long work ahead, horses that would carry people across the Kansas plains and the Texas grassland and the high country to the west, useful and enduring and bred from the best of what two very different bloodlines could produce when you trusted the combination. Ajax turned his head and looked at them from the near pasture with his elder statesman's gaze, neither approving nor disapproving, simply bearing witness. Margaret Easton, Margaret Boone now, Margaret Boone for 9 years, Margaret Boone for the rest of her natural life, stood at the pasture fence in the September light of 1892 with her husband's arm around her, and the enormous Kansas sky above her, and the life she had built in the red dust of an unexpected arrival spread out in every direction. And she thought about that moment in August of 1882 when she had put her bag down and watched the stage roll away, and the world had rearranged itself entirely. She had not run after the stage. He had not chased it. And everything that mattered had begun in the stillness between one moment and the next, in the space where a woman chose to stay, and a man chose to let her, and neither of them pretended that the sensible thing was the same as the right thing. The stage had left without her, and neither of them had chased it, and they had been building ever since a school, a library, a horse operation, 3 children and a 4th on the way that she had not told him yet. A home rooted so deep in this particular stretch of Kansas earth that no ledger discrepancy and no entitled rancher and no panic-stricken land agent could have uprooted it. She would tell him tonight, after supper, at the kitchen table where they told each other everything that mattered. He would look at her with that expression, the open, unheld one, and she would watch the slow smile start in his eyes, and Daniel and Frances Ellen and small William would make their evening noise in the house around them, and the library would be on the east side full of books, and Ajax would stand in the pasture under the enormous stars. And the school would be on the east edge of town with its chalk dust smell, and its 3 classrooms and Alina raised teaching the small ones with the same careful love that Margaret had given them first. All of it proceeding from a bag set down in the red dust of a stage depot, all of it beginning in the space where the stage rolled away and 2 people stood still and refused to be sensible, all of it theirs and true and good. Margaret Boone looked out at the horses in the September evening light, and she was exactly, precisely, completely where she was supposed to be. The wind moved through the cottonwoods along Slate Creek with its old whispering sound, and the stars were already beginning to show at the eastern edge of the sky, one by one, coming on like lanterns in a very large and very honest dark.